Have you ever thought about how many things from the 1950s were quietly risking your life while you were just trying to live it? From mind-changing tech to military machines that could destroy cities, dangerous creations hid behind progress. These inventions show that innovation can be brilliant, but terrifying, and sometimes unstoppable. Let us start with the inventions that defined the decade's reckless confidence, the ones that sounded genius until they were not. Do you remember seeing or hearing about atomic toys? The kind that made kids feel like miniature scientists discovering how the world worked. One of the strangest was the real Atomic Energy Lab, a kit designed to teach children how radiation behaved. If you imagine it now, you might picture plastic pieces or harmless diagrams, but that is not what you would have opened back then. You would have peeled back the lid, smelled that cold metallic scent, and stared at real samples that gave off actual radiation. The kit came with a device that clicked and crackled when you moved the material closer, like it was whispering secrets about invisible forces on your skin. At the time, the world was still enchanted by the promise of nuclear power, the idea that atoms could light up cities and fuel a new age. Today, you would never let a child anywhere near radioactive isotopes. Back then, parents barely blinked. If you had been a kid then, would you have been the one leaning closer, wondering what the glowing particles really felt like? Then there were metal-tipped lawn darts. You did not need a playground to use them. You just needed a backyard, a patch of grass, and a group of kids who had no idea they were tossing spears designed to fall hard and fast. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the weight of the dart slicing through the warm summer air before the thud as it buried itself deep into the ground. It was marketed as a family game, simple, wholesome, something everyone could enjoy. But the physics were unforgiving. The metal tip gave it perfect downward momentum. When it missed the target, it did not bounce, it stabbed. In a world before modern safety standards, it was normal. Today, even the idea of a sharp projectile like that makes you tense. Think about the last backyard game you played. Could you imagine a metal spike sailing past your ankle? And maybe you remember hearing stories about cars without seat belts. Not the soft, cushioned belts you know today. No belts at all. You would slide into the front seat, feel the smooth vinyl against your skin, and there was nothing, no click, no strap crossing your chest, nothing to keep you from flying forward if something went wrong. The car companies wanted you to feel free. They wanted you to slide across the bench seat with ease, to wrap your arm around the person next to you. It was all style over safety. People thought they did not need protection because the roads felt open and empty. Now you do not even think before buckling in. It is muscle memory. But imagine being in that world for a moment. Would you have been one of the people who insisted seatbelts were unnecessary? You did not just see danger on the roads, you could smell it in your home. Take asbestos insulation. It looked harmless, soft, snowy, almost comforting. Workers packed it into the walls with their bare hands because they believed it was the miracle material, fireproof, durable, perfect for keeping a home warm. When you touched it, the fibers clung to your skin like dust that refused to fall away. No one knew, and no one admitted what happened when the particles drifted into your lungs and settled there. Today, asbestos feels like a warning word, But back then, it was a promise of safety. Can you imagine trusting something so completely, only to discover it was poisoning the very air you breathed? Now think about something more personal, something people used on their own bodies. Radium cosmetics. They glowed, literally. You would open a small jar, and the cream inside had a strange shimmer, like moonlight blended into a lotion. Women applied it because magazines told them it made the skin look younger, fresher, and radiant. And in a way, it did. The glow was not just a marketing trick. It came from the radioactive material inside the cream. You would dab it onto your cheekbones without realizing those particles did not stay on the surface. They seeped in. The idea that radiation could rejuvenate you was not considered absurd. It was considered science. Now you look for products that promise clean ingredients, non-toxic formulas, and labels you trust. Would you have been able to resist the temptation of a cream that promised eternal radiance? And then there were the playgrounds, structures made of metal, steel, and heat. The tall, narrow slides that burned your hands on sunny afternoons. The concrete beneath them that did not cushion anything. But one invention stands out: the spinning carousel, the kind teenagers would grab with both hands and run in circles until it turned into a blur. You would climb on, feel the world tilt beneath you, and hope the centrifugal force did not throw you off. The metal rattled, the ground rushed by, and kids pushed harder just to see how long you could hold on. Today, playgrounds cushion every fall. Back then, your childhood bruises told the story of learning the hard way. Do you think you would have held on longer than your friends, or let go just to feel the wild rush of rolling across the grass? You also had the so-called safe household gadgets, and one of the most memorable was the hairdryer that plugged directly into the wall without any safety shutoff. It hummed with a steady, almost soothing sound, blowing warm air through metal coils that glowed faint red when you looked closely. But if water touched it, even a single droplet, the danger was instant. This was before homes had widespread ground fault protection, before warning labels, before people understood how electricity traveled through the body. Now, manufacturers design products to save you from yourself. Back then, you were expected to be careful. Would you have remembered to unplug it every time? And we can't forget the chemical sets, kits for children filled with powders, acids, and tiny bottles that fizzed when mixed. You'd crack them open and instantly smell something sharp and almost sweet, like a science experiment waiting to go wrong. They were made to spark curiosity, and they did. But they also sparked accidents. Even then, parents encouraged exploration because they believed learning came with a little risk. Do you think you would have followed the instructions, or mixed everything just to see what happened? You might not think of furniture as dangerous, but in the 1950s, one invention turned living rooms into quiet hazards: radioactive glassware. Imagine holding a drinking glass that looked like it had trapped a firefly inside, glowing with that eerie green-yellow tint. You would run your fingers over the smooth surface, feeling nothing out of the ordinary, never realizing the shine came from uranium mixed into the glass. It was not enough to hurt you immediately, but over time, the low, steady pulse of radiation turned these beautiful pieces into ticking risks. At the time, the glow felt luxurious, futuristic, a conversation piece to show your guests. Today, you would not let your child drink from anything remotely radioactive. Would you have placed those glasses proudly on your shelf? Or would you have felt that strange prickle in your chest telling you something was not right? Then there were the electric blankets that promised warmth but delivered something far more unpredictable. Picture yourself lying in bed, winter beating against the window, pulling that heavy, heated blanket up to your chin. You would hear the faint buzz inside the fabric, like a trapped swarm of tiny bees. The wires were thin, poorly insulated, and prone to overheating. One wrong fold, one unnoticed kink, and the blanket could smolder quietly while you slept. People trusted them because warmth felt like comfort. But they did not know how easily comfort could turn to catastrophe. Modern heated blankets shut off automatically. They monitor their own temperature like loyal guardians. Back then, you were the only safeguard. Would you have slept soundly, or would you have checked the blanket twice before closing your eyes? And who could forget the cigarettes advertised as healthy? The ones doctors posed with in cheerful black and white photos. You'd open a fresh pack and feel the crisp paper between your fingers, smell that earthy blend of tobacco, and light up believing you were relieving stress the way everyone else did. Some brands even promoted added ingredients like menthol or soothing inhalants, claiming they made the smoke gentler. Instead, they delivered chemicals that scarred lungs and seeded addiction. At the time, you would have felt sophisticated holding one. Today, you know the truth. If you lived back then, would you have trusted the smiling doctor in the ad? Or would you have questioned why something that burned your throat was being sold as therapeutic? But the risk was not just in your home. It was in the sky. In the 1950s, aircraft engineers experimented with magnesium-bodied airplanes. Magnesium is light, so light it seemed like a miracle metal for aviation. But it had one fatal flaw. It ignited easily and burned hotter than almost anything else. Imagine sitting in a plane built partially from a metal that turned into a white-hot torch when sparked. Pilots who tested these aircraft felt proud flying cutting-edge machines, but deep down, some of them felt the weight of that risk every time they touched the throttle. Today's aircraft materials are tested relentlessly. Back then, engineers pushed boundaries first and asked questions later. If you were a pilot then, would the thrill of innovation have outweighed the fear of what could happen if the wrong bolt scraped the wrong surface? Let's step back onto the ground, onto the streets where kids played without fear. Another invention became infamous, the power mower without safety guards. Picture an early lawn mower, metal-bodied and roaring like a small motorcycle. The blade underneath spun fast enough to slice through thick weeds like butter, but there was nothing covering the edges. No guard to block debris, no shield to protect curious children who wandered too close. The smell of gasoline clung to the air. The vibrations traveled up your arms, and clumps of grass flew everywhere, including toward anyone standing nearby. Today's mowers shut off when you let go of the handle. Those older ones didn't care. They devoured anything in their path. Would you have trusted yourself behind that machine, or would you have taken a step back as soon as it roared awake? But perhaps the strangest invention was lead-based candy wrappers. Children would unwrap sweets wrapped in shiny, bright foil that felt cool between their fingers. The foil looked exciting, almost luxurious, and some of it was made with lead. If you were a child, you would tear into the candy, lick your fingers afterward, and never think twice. Lead has no taste, but it leaves a trail in the body that lasts a lifetime. Manufacturers did not know or did not care about the danger. Today, everything your children eat is wrapped under regulation and testing. Back then, it was blind trust. Can you imagine letting a child today unwrap candy with wrappers that could poison them slowly? And then there were the early X-ray shoe-fitting machines, one of the most bizarre ideas to ever enter a department store. You'd stand there at the edge of a wooden platform, slip your feet into an opening, and suddenly the machine would hum softly as the tube inside fired radiation through your shoes. You could actually see the outline of your bones moving when you wiggled your toes. It felt like magic. It felt futuristic. But those machines leaked more radiation into the room than any modern safety limit would ever allow. The clerks who worked beside them all day took the worst of it without knowing. You might walk into a shoe store today and ask for arch support or a size check. But would you have pushed your feet into a glowing wooden box just to see your skeleton? Now think about the kitchens of the 1950s. One invention promised convenience at the cost of safety. Aluminum pressure cookers had faulty locks. Imagine cooking stew, hearing the gentle hiss of steam rising, not realizing that the locking mechanism was prone to flipping open under the slightest defect. When it failed, the lid did not just open, it exploded upward like a launched missile, spraying boiling food across ceilings and walls. The pressure inside built silently, the metal warmed under the heat, and one moment of weakness sent the whole device into chaos. Today's pressure cookers have multiple safety valves. Back then, you just hoped yours would not be the one to blow. Could you imagine stirring your pot while wondering if it might erupt at any moment? The medical world was not exempt from risky inventions. One of the most unsettling examples was the early pacemaker powered by external wires and exposed components. Imagine having a device sewn into your chest, but relying on wires running outside your skin to connect to a power source. Every tug, every accidental pull, every unseen strain posed a threat. Patients were grateful because the device kept them alive, but they had to live carefully, almost delicately, like porcelain figures. Today, pacemakers are sealed, safe, and reliable. Back then, it was a life saved at the cost of daily fear. Would you have lived boldly despite the risk, or tiptoed through your days? Let's return to the playground, because another danger wasn't in the spinning carousels, but in the toy rockets that shot far higher than anyone expected. You'd pump them, load them with small chemical charges, then flip the switch and watch them scream upward with a sharp hiss. The excitement was intoxicating. The rockets came down unpredictably, though, sometimes straight toward the group of kids who launched them. They were small versions of real propulsion systems, built with little regard for where they might land. Now, every child's toy is tested for safety. Back then, wonder came first. Do you think you would have stood in the open field waiting for it to fall, or run for cover as soon as it vanished into the sky? And one invention quietly filled homes with danger. Early refrigerator coolants like methyl format. The machines hummed serenely in the corner of the kitchen, keeping milk cold and leftovers fresh. But if a line cracked or a valve loosened, the gas could leak out, sweet-smelling, almost pleasant, but deadly in enclosed spaces. People trusted refrigerators the way you trust your phone charger now. Something always plugged in, always running, always safe. But those early models held risks invisible to the families who gathered around them daily. Would you have noticed the smell or brushed it off as just another scent in the kitchen? One of the most unsettling inventions of the era was not something you held or wore. It was something sprayed over entire neighborhoods with pride. Early insecticide fog trucks rolled slowly down suburban streets, pouring out thick, ghostly clouds of DDT that drifted like artificial fog. Children would run behind them laughing, disappearing into that milky haze as if it were a magical mist. The air smelled sharp and chemical, but strangely clean, like a bitter cousin of fresh rain. Parents believed it kept mosquitoes away and that it protected the neighborhood from disease. But no one realized that each breath carried a toxin designed to disrupt biological systems. You trusted the trucks because everyone else did. Today, you would never let a child anywhere near a cloud of poison. But if you were there, would you have raced through that fog with the other children, or hung back because something in your gut felt wrong? Then there were the backyard chemistry thrills, the homemade flamethrower kits marketed as adventure toys. The advertisements showed boys wearing goggles, aiming metal tubes that spewed controlled bursts of fire. You would hear the pressurized hiss, see the sudden bloom of flame leaping out like a dragon's breath, and feel the heat wash over your skin. It was intoxicating, danger compressed into a handheld device. These kits encouraged experimentation without explaining the physics of fuel vaporization or flashback ignition. In a world that romanticized danger, a burst of fire felt heroic. Today, even mentioning such a device makes parents flinch. If you had been in that backyard, would you have squeezed the trigger just once, just to see that fire bloom? Homes had their own hidden threats too, like early aerosol cleaners packed with chlorinated solvents. You'd grab a can, shake it, and hear the liquid sloshing inside, a sound so ordinary you never questioned it. Then you pressed the nozzle and released a blast of cold mist that smelled sharp, sterile, almost refreshing. People used it on countertops, bathrooms, even children's toys. But when the mist lingered in the air, it carried compounds that could numb your senses, irritate your lungs, and in high enough concentrations, knock you out without warning. Regulations did not exist yet. You learned by trial, by error, by experience. Today, labels warn you in bold letters. Back then, would you have noticed your eyes stinging and stepped back, or kept spraying because you were chasing that clean scent? Some dangers came disguised as innovation, like early microwave ovens. These machines weren't sealed the way you know them today. Some leaked radiation through poorly insulated doors. Others had weak magnetic shielding that let microwaves leak into the kitchen. You would put in a plate of leftovers, hear that humming vibration that felt both mechanical and alive, and wait for the bell. In those early days, you could stand close and feel a strange warmth on your skin, not from the oven's heat, but from the radiation seeping through the metal seams. People didn't fully understand the risks, and they trusted the new technology like it was a gift from the future. Today, you would never stand with your nose pressed near the door. But back then, would curiosity have pulled you in anyway? And then there was the infamous toy cap pistol with real explosive caps. Imagine holding a small metal pistol, heavier than you expect, with a cold barrel and a trigger that clicked sharply. You'd place the tiny caps inside, little circles of red paper filled with real explosive powder. The moment you snapped the trigger, a loud pop echoed, followed by the smell of burnt sulfur that lingered on your fingers. Some caps misfired. Some burst with more force than they should. Tiny fragments could shoot backward, forward, sideways. Children felt power using them, like miniature cowboys reenacting movie scenes. Today's toy guns glow orange and use harmless clicks. Back then, would you have loved the thrill or felt uneasy as the smoke curled from the pistol's muzzle? Factories embraced a new, dangerous invention, polychlorinated biphenyls, spelled PCBs. These chemicals seemed perfect for electrical equipment because they did not burn easily and they carried current efficiently. Workers handled them with bare hands, wiping residue from metal surfaces with rags that smelled faintly sweet and oily. But PCBs seeped into clothing, skin, water, and soil. Over time, they became one of the most notorious toxic substances ever manufactured. In the 1950s, though, they felt like a miracle solution. Companies praised them. Workers trusted them. Today, they are banned almost everywhere. If you were a factory worker then, would you have questioned the oily sheen on your palms or shrugged it off as just another day on the job? And then you had the early mercury-based floor finishes. You would open a tin can and see a glossy liquid that shimmered like molten silver. The smell was metallic and sharp, with a coldness that settled in your nose. You would pour it onto wooden floors, spreading it with long strokes of a cloth, watching the mercury-laced shine transform the surface into something almost mirror-like. It made floors gleam, resist wear, and look new. But the vapors rose invisibly, drifting through the house, entering lungs and bloodstream quietly. Families admired the shine without knowing what floated in the air around them. Today, you would call a hazard hotline if a drop of mercury spilled. Back then, would the beauty of that shine have distracted you from the faint, metallic scent in the air? Let's talk about something even more bizarre. Children's building sets that included real, sharp metal pieces, edges unrounded, corners pointed, ready to slice skin at the slightest wrong move. Kids used them to build miniature cars, cranes, bridges, towering structures with moving parts. You could hear the clink of metal pieces, the satisfying snap of a bolt tightening, the scratchy sound of steel sliding across steel. Creativity had no limits, and neither did the danger. Today's building toys are soft, colorful, designed for safety. Those older sets felt like real engineering tools. If you had them, would you have built something careful or pushed your luck trying to make the tallest tower in the room? Even the beauty industry had its missteps. One of the most dangerous was beryllium-based cosmetics used in some powders and creams. Beryllium is lightweight, but when turned into fine particles, it becomes a lung hazard. Women dipped soft brushes into shimmering powders that looked ethereal, then swept them onto their cheeks, breathing in tiny clouds with each stroke. The scent was faint and floral, the texture silky, the effect luminous. But those particles did not just vanish, they settled deep in the lungs. Today, formulas go through rigorous testing. Back then, women trusted what smelled good and looked pretty. Would you have asked questions or simply admired the glow? And finally, one invention captures the spirit of the 1950s perfectly: the experimental anti-fatigue gas for drivers. Some companies sold small inhalers filled with stimulant vapor designed to jolt tired motorists awake. Picture a driver on a lonely highway, windows down, wind roaring, reaching into the glove compartment for a small metal tube. One inhale, and a sharp, mint-like sting rushed up the nose, jolting the senses. For a moment, everything sharpened: the road lines, the headlights, the distant hum of the engine. But the gas pushed the body too fast, too hard. Drivers became jittery, overconfident, wired. Reaction times worsened instead of improving. Today, you sip coffee or pull over to rest. Back then, people believed technology could push human limits. Would you have trusted that inhale to keep you alert, or realized the cost hidden behind the quick rush? You might think by now you've seen every strange, dangerous idea the 1950s had to offer, but one more invention deserves its own quiet moment in your mind: the home radon health machine. People believed radon, yes, the radioactive gas, could rejuvenate the body. Imagine walking into a wellness center, or even someone's basement, seeing a small metal chamber humming softly. You'd step inside and warm air would swirl around you, carrying invisible particles meant to stimulate vitality. The air felt thick, heavy, almost mineral-like. People stepped out believing they were energized, unaware that the very gas they inhaled was seeping silently into their lungs, laying down seeds of long-term harm. Today, radon is something you test your home for in fear. Back then, would you have trusted a machine promising renewed vigor, or hesitated when you felt that strange warmth on your skin? While radiation-based inventions dominated the decade, fire hazards had their own notorious representative: the decorative aluminum Christmas tree paired with the rotating color wheel. Picture a tall silver tree made entirely of thin, sharp aluminum needles that caught and reflected every stray glint of light. The color wheel sat beside it, rotating slowly, shining bright red, blue, green, and amber onto the branches. But many families did not know that plugging Christmas lights directly into a metal tree created a perfect conductor for electricity. One faulty bulb, one frayed wire, and the entire shimmering sculpture could turn into a live electrical hazard. The crackle of electricity against aluminum was not something anyone expected during the holidays. Today, Christmas decorations are designed with endless fail-safe-ifs. But back then, would you have plugged those lights in anyway, just to see the tree glow? Another household marvel came in the form of early space heaters with exposed, glowing coils. Imagine that deep orange red of heated metal, the color that looked warm, inviting, almost comforting. You would place the heater near your feet and feel a steady wave of heat roll across your skin. But those coils were inches away from blankets, curtains, carpets, or the loose edge of a child's pajamas. One stray touch, one moment of forgetfulness, and the coil could ignite anything nearby. People kept them close because warmth felt like safety. Today, heaters shut off the moment they tilt an inch. Back then, the line between comfort and catastrophe was razor thin. Would you have kept it on all night, or turned it off even if the cold crept into your bones. Cars weren't immune to dangerous innovation either. Early collapsible steering columns were designed before safety standards. They didn't collapse the right way at all. They often speared inward upon impact. Imagine gripping a steering wheel with the road humming beneath you, feeling in control, not knowing that the metal column behind it was rigid and unforgiving. During a crash, instead of compressing, it forced its way toward the driver. People loved the cars for their style, the fins, the chrome, the growl of the engine. But beneath the beauty was a hidden threat. Today, steering columns fold like accordions to protect you. Back then, would you have taken the wheel without a second thought, trusting your reflexes to keep you safe? And perhaps the darkest invention on this list hides behind a deceptively cheerful idea: nuclear-powered toys for kids. Real miniature nuclear components, albeit weak, found their way into educational science sets. Imagine opening a kit filled with slides, dials, small test tubes, and a sample that emitted a faint glow under the right light. Kids felt like scientists, experimenting in their bedrooms with materials far beyond their understanding. The sample might have been small, but the radiation exposure added up each time they held it close or pressed their face near the viewer. Today, you would never let a child near anything radioactive. But back then, would curiosity have overridden caution? Let's return to the world of transportation, where steam-powered cars still lingered in experimental pockets. These cars stored highly pressurized steam in large tanks, and the engines hissed like mechanical serpents. When the pressure was stable, everything worked beautifully, the car gliding forward with a soft, chuffing rhythm. But one weakened valve, one overpressurized tank, and the engine could rupture explosively. Metal shrapnel would fly outward with terrifying force. The sound was not a pop, it was a deep, gut-punching boom. Today's cars go through safety tests by the thousands. Those experimental steam cars were gambles on wheels. Would you have driven one just to experience the smooth glide, or refused the keys the moment you heard that hiss? Then there were the early electric hair dryers with exposed heating elements. They were heavy, usually chrome-bodied, and when you switched them on, they roared like a tiny jet engine. The coils inside glowed orange, visible through the vent holes. The heat they generated was intense, good for drying hair fast, but far too close to skin, fabric, and even the hair itself. People burned themselves without understanding how quickly the heat could spike. Today's hairdryers are insulated, shielded, calibrated. One especially disturbing invention was the shock belt, marketed as a posture correction device. People wore it around their waist, and when they slouched, it sent a mild electrical jolt. They believed discipline could be delivered through current. Imagine walking through a grocery store, reaching for something on a shelf, and suddenly feeling a sharp snap of electricity in your back. The belt didn't differentiate between movements. It punished everything. The sensation was startling, almost like being stung by a tiny mechanical wasp. People tolerated it because posture was prized. But would you have worn something that shocked you for being human? Let us revisit the kitchen. Early deep fryers were essentially open vats of boiling oil with no temperature regulation. You would plug it in, pour the oil, and listen to the faint crackle as it heated. There was no thermometer, no automatic shut-off, no safety lock. The oil could go from hot to dangerously overheated in minutes. One drop of water or one accidental splash could make the fryer erupt into a splatter of scalding liquid. Families used them because frying at home felt modern. Today's fryers are enclosed, controlled, predictable. But back then, would you have lowered that basket with confidence or stepped back because the heat felt too wild? Another astonishingly risky invention was the health sauna suit, a plastic full-body outfit worn to trap heat and force rapid sweating. People zipped themselves in, feeling the cling of plastic against their skin, the air growing hotter with every breath. The inside grew humid, slick, suffocatingly warm. The body struggled to cool itself, and dehydration lurked in the background. But people believed sweating meant detoxing. Today, you would never wrap yourself in something designed to trap heat. Back then, though, would you have zipped it up just to feel like you were pushing your body towards some imagined peak? Another invention on this journey encapsulates everything risky, hopeful, and naive about the 1950s, the household self-defense pen gun. It looked like a regular pen, sleek, metal, pocket-sized. With a twist and a click, it could fire a real bullet. People carried it thinking it would protect them, not realizing how easily it could discharge accidentally. The weight felt deceptive, light enough to forget, dangerous enough to ruin a life. Today, such a device would not survive a single legal review. But in that era of experimentation, it was just another novelty. If you held that pen, would you feel safer or realize quickly that some tools should never fit in a pocket? You might remember the flashbulbs before you remember the cameras. Those single-use glass bulbs photographers would twist into place, the ones that looked harmless, almost elegant. You would hear that tiny metallic click, then bang, a burst of blue-white light so bright you could feel it prickle your skin. What you did not know was that inside those bulbs, magnesium wire burned at temperatures hot enough to melt metal, and the glass sometimes shattered from the heat. Photographers got showered with tiny glass fragments all the time, and everyone acted like it was part of the job. Today, you would never let someone point something at your face that is basically an explosive, but back then, you just blinked away the spots in your eyes and smiled. Ever wonder how many photos of you as a kid were taken with something that could have exploded in your direction? Hovering right there in that same era was the toxic foam fire extinguisher, the heavy red canister every school and office kept in the corner. To you, it smelled like metal and dust. To adults, it was a miracle, foam thick enough to choke any flame. But the foam came from PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances that we now treat like environmental nightmares, the kind that linger in the human body for decades. Firefighters from the 1950s had no idea they were coating themselves and everyone around them in chemicals that resisted heat and water, and unfortunately entered their own bloodstream. Today, we treat PFAS like poison, but back then, people rubbed foam off their shoes with their bare hands. Do you ever think about how normal that felt? Then there were the nitro-powered race toys, the tiny metal cars that looked harmless until you got close. You could smell the nitromethane fuel as soon as someone opened the bottle, a bitter, sharp scent that made your eyes water. Kids would wind up those engines, light the spark, and watch the cars tear around the driveway at insane speeds. fast enough to slice open bare ankles or whip into a wall and send shards flying. And parents did not worry, because it was just a toy. Today, we would not dream of giving children a miniature combustion engine fueled by explosive chemicals. But you probably remember crouching down, heart racing, as that little car sputtered to life. Did you ever jump back just a second too late? Or maybe you remember the asbestos snow used in Christmas decorations. It came in soft white flakes, packed in paper bags with pictures of smiling families. When you sprinkled it across a tree or windowsill, it looked magical, clean, bright, and soft as real winter. But each flake was made of needle-like asbestos fibers that could lodge in your lungs forever. It didn't smell like danger. It didn't feel sharp or chemical. You could run your hands through it like shredded paper. Hollywood used it on movie sets, department stores poured it on Santa's displays, and parents let kids toss handfuls into the air like confetti. Today, we treat asbestos like a death sentence. Back then, it felt like holiday joy. Do you ever think about how many Christmas mornings you breathed in without knowing what floated around you? Right alongside that came the electric blanket with unshielded wiring. You remember those, warm, heavy, and smelling faintly like old fabric heated by a radiator. You would plug one in, feel the warmth slowly crawl across your body, and drift off to sleep without ever realizing that inside the blanket, the wires rubbed against the fabric with every move you made. Over time, insulation wore down like pencil erasers. One frayed wire, one spark, and the entire bed could ignite. Fire departments in the 1950s recorded hundreds of house fires from them, more than almost any other appliance. And still, people kept using them because winter nights were cold and comfort was comfort. Today, safety regulators would not let something like that get past the design phase. But you probably remember tugging that blanket up to your chin without a second thought. Did you ever wake up smelling hot cloth and never realize you had been inches from disaster? Another quiet invention from that decade was the home shoe-fitting fluoroscope, something you might remember standing on in a department store. It looked like a wooden box with chrome trim and little viewing windows. You'd slip your feet inside, and suddenly a glowing green X-ray image appeared, showing your bones inside the shoes. Kids loved it. Parents trusted it. Stores advertised it as cutting-edge science. But each time you stepped on it, your feet, and sometimes the clerks' faces, were blasted with radiation levels that would get a modern medical facility shut down instantly. Some clerks even developed burns and cataracts from standing near them all day. Today, we'd never let you casually look inside your bones for fun. But do you remember how fascinating it felt to wiggle your toes and see the skeleton move? And maybe one of the wildest inventions was the radium-painted fishing lure. Anglers loved them because they glowed underwater. That eerie green shimmer drew fish right in, especially at dawn or dusk. But the paint, it was the same radioactive compound used on watch dials that made the radium girls sick decades earlier. Touching the lure transferred particles that could be inhaled or absorbed through the skin. For anyone who stored them in tackle boxes or pockets, the exposure was constant. Today, we treat radioactive materials like hazardous waste, but back then, people dangled them into lakes like harmless toys. Do you still remember that faint, ghostly glow? You might also remember mercury-based mildew cleaners, thick, colorless liquids that smelled metallic and sharp. Housewives used them to scrub bathroom tiles until they sparkled, believing mercury was the most powerful germ killer known to science. It was powerful. All right, powerful enough to seep through the skin and lodge in the nervous system. Surfaces became contaminated, sinks carried residue for weeks, and anyone cleaning without gloves absorbed more than they realized. Today, mercury is strictly controlled for safety. But back then, it was part of the Saturday routine. Did you ever help someone clean the bathroom and notice your hands smelled strange afterward? Another forgotten invention was the high-pressure kitchen fryer. These bulky countertop cookers promised restaurant-level fried chicken in minutes. You would pour oil inside, clamp the lid, and wait until the little metal dial hit the right mark. But people did not realize that these devices lacked pressure release valves. If steam built up too fast, the entire pot could burst, splattering scalding oil across the kitchen like shrapnel. Early safety testing barely existed, and many households learned the hard way why pressure cookers should not trap oil. Today, you would need multiple certifications before selling something like that. Do you remember the sound of that metal lid rattling, like it was breathing? And then there were the lead crystal baby bottles. They looked luxurious, thick, clear glass that felt cool and smooth in your hand. Parents believed they were buying the safest, highest quality bottles imaginable. But lead leached into warm milk, especially when the bottle was heated or washed repeatedly. Infants drank microdoses of lead every day, and nobody understood why developmental issues were rising. Today, we scan products for lead content before they ever reach a shelf. But do you remember those bottles sitting in warm water baths, ready for feeding time? You probably remember the chlorinated hydrocarbon fogger, even if the name does not ring a bell. It was the metal canister your neighbors wheeled through their yard on summer evenings, the one that sent out thick, white fog to kill mosquitoes. The cloud rolled across lawns like mist from a horror movie, and kids ran through it laughing because it felt cool on their skin. What no one told you was that the fog was loaded with DDT and other chlorinated pesticides that clung to clothing, seeped into soil, and stayed in bodies for years. The smell was a strange mix of sweetness and gasoline. Today, we treat those chemicals like environmental time bombs, but you might still remember how slowly that fog drifted, waiting for you to walk through it. Did you ever take a deep breath inside that cloud without realizing what you had just inhaled? Then there was the cortisone tanning lamp, a dangerous fusion of medical promise and cosmetic obsession. These lamps blasted you with ultraviolet radiation under the illusion that cortisone-infused bulbs would make your skin healthier while giving you a perfect bronze glow. People sat under them for half an hour at a time, trusting the warm, buzzing light. But these lamps emitted ultraviolet doses higher than anything used for medical therapy today. Skin burns, retinal damage, and premature aging were common, and the cortisone coating offered no protection at all. Today, dermatologists would recoil at the thought. Do you remember how people swore the light made them feel renewed, even when it left their skin stinging? And tucked into kitchens everywhere were the kerosene food warmers. Small, simple devices, usually just a metal base with a wick used to keep food warm during parties or picnics. They smelled like a mix of heated metal and faint fuel vapor. But kerosene burns unevenly, and one sudden flare-up could ignite tablecloths or plates, a real danger. Worse, fumes collected in enclosed spaces, sometimes causing dizziness or nausea. Today, warming trays use electricity and thermostats. Back then, people lit an open flame just 2 inches from the potato salad. Do you remember leaning close to scoop food and feeling that little blast of heat hit your wrist? Another invention hiding in plain sight was the mercuric oxide button battery. These tiny power sources were used in toys, watches, and hearing aids. You remember how they looked: flat, silver, barely bigger than a fingernail. But inside was a paste loaded with mercury and oxidizing agents. When these batteries corroded or ruptured, mercury leaked onto skin or surfaces. Kids who swallowed them, something that happened far more often than you would think, were exposed to toxic doses. Today, mercury batteries are banned worldwide. But do you remember opening a toy and seeing that little silver disc roll across the floor, not knowing how dangerous it truly was? Then there were the chemical heat packs for winter clothing, thin inserts people slid into their gloves or boots before stepping out into the cold. They heated up when exposed to air, thanks to a mixture of iron filings, salt, activated charcoal, and sometimes even quicklime, which generated heat rapidly. But early versions burned far too hot. Some reached temperatures that caused blistering or melted fabric. And if the pack tore open, the powder irritated the skin and lungs. Today's hand warmers are regulated and temperature limited. But do you remember shaking one of those early packs and feeling it get hot almost instantly, hotter than anything you'd trust now? And tucked onto basement shelves were old-style home radon testers. They were not electronic devices. They were small vials filled with phosphorescent zinc sulfide powder. The idea was that radiation in the home would excite the powder and make it glow, giving homeowners a visual reading. But the vials themselves were often contaminated with radioactive materials to normalize the glow. People kept them on nightstands or in drawers, not realizing the tester was exposing them far more than any potential radon in their home. Today, radon tests are simple and safe. Back then, the test was sometimes more dangerous than the thing it was testing for. Do you remember seeing one of those little glowing tubes and thinking it looked almost magical? Another surprisingly dangerous invention was the industrial-strength solvent pen. These looked like oversized markers loaded with trichloroethylene or carbon tetrachloride, solvents strong enough to dissolve grease instantly. Mechanics loved them because a quick stroke wiped away oil stains like magic. But one breath of the fumes could cause dizziness, and prolonged exposure damaged the liver and kidneys. People kept them in shirt pockets, uncapped, believing they were no different from felt-tip pens. Today, you couldn't legally sell something like that to the public. But do you remember that sharp chemical bite that hit your nose the moment someone uncapped one? And you might recall pressurized plant sprayers, those metal canisters gardeners pumped by hand until they hissed with pressure. They held herbicides and pesticides made with compounds we now classify as carcinogens and neurotoxins. When you squeezed the trigger, a fine mist coated everything, including the person using it. The smell was earthy but sharp, the kind that clung to your clothes until evening. Today, no sprayer goes untested for safety. Back then, people walked through their gardens enveloped in chemical clouds. Did you ever follow behind someone spraying, thinking nothing of the droplets settling onto your skin? Then came the explosive nail-driving tools, early versions of what professionals now call powder-actuated tools. They used .22 caliber charges to fire nails into concrete or steel. Construction workers carried them onto job sites with barely any training. A misfire could launch a nail sideways at lethal speeds. Some devices did not have safety interlocks, so they could fire if dropped or bumped. Back then, these tools were treated like simple hammers with a little extra power. Today, manufacturers follow strict engineering standards. Do you remember the deafening crack they made, echoing through unfinished buildings? One of the strangest inventions was the chemical toilet deodorizer cake. People dropped these into home toilets and outhouses. They smelled menthol-like, almost pleasant. But they were made with paradichlorobenzene, a compound that vaporized into the air and caused dizziness, respiratory irritation, and long-term organ damage. People kept them in bathrooms without realizing they were breathing toxic fumes every time they sat down. Today, companies use safer alternatives. But do you remember that strong, almost medicinal scent lingering around old bathrooms? You might remember the portable acetylene soldering pen, a small handheld tool sold to hobbyists who wanted to repair metal at home. It used tiny acetylene cartridges that hissed when opened, releasing a sharp, almost bitter smell, like a mix of burnt dust and chemicals. The flame it produced burned blue and needle-thin, hot enough to melt copper in seconds. The problem was that acetylene becomes explosive under pressure, or when mixed improperly with oxygen. These pens leaked, flared, or backfired without warning, sometimes sending flames shooting backward into the user's hand. Today, acetylene is handled only with strict safety protocols. But do you remember the thrill of watching someone fire one up on a workbench, not knowing they were one spark away from disaster? Then there were the early ultrasonic pest repellers. They plugged into the wall and emitted a high-pitched buzzing tone meant to keep rodents and insects away. To you, the sound was barely audible, just a faint, whining ring at the edge of your hearing. But inside the sealed case, poorly shielded circuits overheated constantly. Some units got hot enough to scorch wood paneling or melt the plastic housing. And because no one thought to include automatic shutoffs, they ran non-stop, slowly cooking themselves. Today's electronics come with thermal cut-off switches and fire-retardant casings. Back then, something as simple as pest control could turn into an electrical fire. Do you remember hearing that soft, irritating hum and never imagining it was the sound of something slowly burning? Another invention that seemed brilliant at the time was liquid shoe polish that contained carbon tetrachloride. It wiped on smooth, smelled slightly sweet, and made leather gleam like new. But carbon tetrachloride is a potent neurotoxin that can cause dizziness, headaches, and even organ failure with enough exposure. People brushed it on shoes in small, unventilated closets or bedrooms, breathing in fumes that sank low and stayed in the air for hours. Today, those chemicals are banned from consumer products entirely. Do you remember kneeling on the floor, polishing your shoes before school or church, surrounded by that chemical scent? And one of the strangest dangers came from a pressurized whipped cream dispenser, the early metal canisters that relied on nitrous oxide cartridges. The idea was simple. Attach a cartridge, shake the can, press the nozzle, and instant whipped cream came out. But the metal they used in the 1950s was inconsistent. Some canisters fractured along the seams, turning the device into a small explosive that shot across the room or shattered in the user's hand. Nitrous oxide expands rapidly, and with no pressure release valves, the smallest defect caused failure. Today, quality standards prevent that kind of accident. But do you remember hearing stories of those canisters bursting like firecrackers? Then there was the ammonia-activated cold wave perm kit, beloved in beauty salons. Women used them to curl their hair at home. You mixed 2 bottles. The first released ammonia vapors so strong they made your eyes water instantly. Those fumes were not just irritating. They could damage the lungs with repeated exposure. And if the mixture touched the scalp, chemical burns were common. Yet people sat with their heads wrapped in plastic caps, breathing in that sharp, throat-burning air for half an hour, thinking beauty required a little discomfort. Today, formulas are regulated and milder. But do you remember the smell of those salons, like an entire room filled with stinging invisible needles? You might also recall the early television degaussing coil, a heavy circular device technicians used when television screens became discolored. They plugged it in, flipped the switch, and the coil hummed with an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to scramble the image. But in the 1950s, insulation around those coils often cracked from heat. One exposed wire could deliver a direct shock powerful enough to throw a person back. Others overheated, setting carpeting or furniture smoldering underneath them. Today, technician tools are insulated to absurd levels of safety. But do you remember watching someone wave that glowing ring in front of a television like a magic trick? And then there were the early disposable fuel tablets used for camping or emergency cooking. They looked like small white blocks, solid, light, almost chalky. They were made with hexamin or trioxin, chemicals that burned with a nearly invisible blue flame. If a breeze shifted, you could not see the fire's edge until it licked your fingertips. When the tablets were stored improperly, they crumbled and released fumes that irritated the eyes and lungs. Today, safer fuels dominate the market. But do you remember the strange smell of those tablets when someone struck a match near them? Another forgotten invention was the ultraviolet sanitizing baby bottle cabinet. It looked modern, sleek metal sides, a little glass window, and a glowing violet bulb inside. Parents placed washed bottles in it, believing ultraviolet radiation would sterilize everything, and it did. The problem was that the cabinets leaked ultraviolet C light through cracks, poorly fitted doors, and cheap hinges. Anyone standing nearby was exposed to radiation strong enough to cause skin irritation or eye damage. Some models even allowed a direct line of sight to the bulb if you crouched. Today, devices like that undergo rigorous testing. But do you remember watching that violet glow and feeling mesmerized by it? And tucked into many garages were the chlorine-based metal cleaners, sold as miracle fluids that stripped rust in seconds. You dipped a brush in the liquid and spread it across metal tools or bike frames, watching rust vanish like magic. But these cleaners released chlorine gas when they touched certain metals or reacted with water. Yes, chlorine gas, the same chemical used in wartime. People used them without gloves, masks, or ventilation. Today, that would be unthinkable. But do you remember that harsh, eye-watering sting that floated up from the bucket? The craziest part of all these inventions isn't just how dangerous they were, it's how ordinary they felt at the time. You used them, lived around them, even trusted them. And now you look back and wonder how any of us made it out of that decade. You probably remember the sodium-filled street lamp bulbs, even if you did not know what made them glow. They cast that odd yellow-orange light, humming softly above sidewalks like sleepy insects. Inside, early versions contained metallic sodium sealed under vacuum. If one of those bulbs cracked, even slightly, and moisture entered, the sodium reacted violently, bursting into flames or producing caustic fumes. Utility workers handled them bare-handed, swapping bulbs while standing on metal ladders in the cold. Today, street lamps are engineered so tightly that nothing inside can escape. But do you remember staring up at those lights, listening to their faint buzz, never knowing the fire trapped inside them? Then there was the formaldehyde carpet freshener. It came as a fine powder, the kind that puffed into the air when you sprinkled it across a rug. It smelled sharp and strangely clean, like the inside of a brand new suitcase. The idea was simple: freshen the carpet before guests arrived. But formaldehyde is a known irritant and carcinogen. Those powder particles drifted into your lungs, irritated your throat, and clung to fabric for days. People vacuumed over them, releasing even more into the air. Today, formaldehyde levels in household products are regulated down to fractions of a percent. But do you remember leaning down to shake that powder onto the carpet, watching dust clouds dance in sunlight? Another half-forgotten invention was the early polonium spark plug enhancer. These were add-ons sold to drivers who wanted better ignition. A tiny amount of polonium, yes, radioactive polonium, was embedded in the center electrode to ionize the air and improve spark reliability. It worked, but the radiation risk was not worth the performance boost. When plugs cracked or corroded, polonium dust escaped. Mechanics inhaled the dust without knowing it. Today, radioactive car parts are unthinkable. But do you remember the smell of old garages, oil, rubber, and metal? And never imagining that something far more dangerous hid in those bins of replacement parts? And tucked into so many kitchen drawers were the thermal shock glass pots. Companies swore they were indestructible, able to go from freezer to stovetop without cracking. The truth was far less magical. Sudden temperature changes caused microfractures that spread like veins. These pots shattered explosively, sending razor-edged shards flying. Many kitchens saw dinners turn into emergencies in seconds. Today, cookware standards require specific stress tests. Back then, you trusted the promise printed on the box. Do you remember the first time you heard glass pop from heat and felt that jolt of fear? One invention that still surprises people today was the ammonium nitrate home fertilizer brick. It was a simple white block you dissolved in water for your garden. But ammonium nitrate is the same compound used in explosives. Stored improperly, when it was too warm or too humid, it became unstable. In the 1950s, there were cases of shed fires turning into full explosions because a few fertilizer bricks overheated. Today, ammonium nitrate distribution is tightly controlled. But do you remember those little bricks sitting in paper wrappers, innocent as chalk? Then came the early halogen bike lights. They were bright, much brighter than anything battery-powered at the time. Cyclists loved them, but the bulbs inside reached extremely high temperatures, hot enough to ignite clothing if touched shortly after use. Some housings melted, exposing wires and creating short circuits. Today's bike lights barely warm up. But do you remember pedaling home at dusk, headlight glowing fiercely, without realizing you were carrying a tiny furnace? Another invention was the chemical silverware tarnish remover, a cream that made dull utensils shine instantly. It smelled metallic, acidic, and slightly sweet. The secret was thiourea, a compound now classified as carcinogenic. People dipped forks and spoons into bowls of the stuff, then rinsed them lightly before setting the dinner table. Some residue always stuck. Today, food contact products go through rigorous review. But do you remember swirling a rag in that slick white cream, watching the stains disappear like magic? Mercury tilt thermostats were small devices hidden inside household heaters. When the room cooled, a glass tube inside tipped, and a glob of liquid mercury slid to complete the circuit. The function worked, but the real problem was what happened when those thermostats broke. Mercury spilled onto floors, and homes filled with vapor you could not see or smell. Mercury-free thermostats are standard today. But do you remember tapping those old beige boxes on the wall, trying to wake them up, never realizing what sat behind the cover? One of the most overlooked inventions was the chlorinated brake cleaner. It cut through grime instantly, and it dried so fast it seemed to vanish. But when heated, for example, by welding or even just warm machinery, those chemicals transformed into phosgene gas, one of the deadliest substances ever used in war. Mechanics unknowingly breathed it in during routine work. Today, these formulas are banned or heavily restricted. Do you remember that icy cold blast of spray hitting hot metal and the strange smell that followed? And the final invention on this list might be one you saw more often than any other, the solid fuel home air freshener. A thick gel block sat in a tin or glass jar and slowly released fragrance as it evaporated. Those gels were made with volatile solvents, some flammable, some toxic, all unregulated. If placed near heat, the block could melt rapidly, emitting concentrated fumes or even igniting. People kept them in bathrooms, on windowsills, or next to warm radiators. Today's air fresheners are tested and controlled. But do you remember that strong, perfumed scent lingering long after the block shrank to nothing? Looking back now, it's surreal. You lived in a world filled with inventions that were exciting, futuristic, and unbelievably hazardous, all at the same time. And somehow, you moved through it with the kind of trust only a different era could give you. If you have ever wondered why the 1950s feel like such a strange mix of innocence and danger, well, maybe it is because every corner of your life held a secret the world had not discovered yet. You have walked through a world where innovation moved faster than caution, where hope outpaced understanding, and where people trusted the future blindly. These inventions were not just objects, they were reflections of a society eager to push boundaries, even if it meant walking straight into danger without realizing it. If any of these memories stirred something in you, if you felt that flicker of recognition, that moment where you imagined yourself living through it, then make sure to click one of the cards playing on your screen to watch similar videos.